One of the most common questions that I get from women in our community, and I get this over and over and over again, is who should pay for the date, the man or the woman? So today I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to give you a bunch of different perspectives on this. And then I'm going to give you my suggestion based on some of those suggestions or the perspectives that I give you. And then you can make a decision for yourself on what you want men to do, what you're planning on doing. So who should pay for the date, the man or the woman? Hello, my name is Matthew Coast and welcome to my channel. And so today we're going to be covering this very interesting topic here. And I wanted to set the record straight for once and for all. So let's talk about a few things first. So number one, investment is incredibly important. Does it actually matter from an investment standpoint? One of the things that you'll know from investment is that the more somebody is invested in something, the more they feel attached to it, the more that they're willing to backwards rationalize how much they like that thing, the more a man's willing to, generally speaking, fall in love if he's more invested in something. And the more you're invested in something, the more you'll have those feelings as well. And so investment is a very, very important thing. And financial investment does matter. It absolutely does matter. So like I said, how invested he is in you will determine how much he's attached to you and how willing he is to kind of let you go or not feel like he wants to let you go. So you want him to be more invested. You want him to invest from time, energy, financial, emotional standpoint, thought standpoint. You want him to invest a lot in you if you want a real committed relationship with this man. So it's in your best interest to have him pay from an investment standpoint. It's in your best interest for him to pay for dates. However, it's in his best interest from an investment standpoint, just from an investment standpoint, to not pay for the date, to have either split the bill or have you pay for some of the date from an investment standpoint financially. However, oh wait, I have one more thing to say about it. Also, it sets a frame and a precedent for the future. So if you go on a first date with a guy and he doesn't pay and he splits the bill with you, or let's say you pay, then that sets a precedent for the rest of the times that you guys meet up with each other and hang out with each other. It sets a frame for how he's going to treat you in the relationship. And he might start expecting that you're going to pay your way with everything it is that you do. And maybe you want that and maybe you don't. Kind of depends on the woman here. But from a financial standpoint, it's far more important for him to pay for you. However, financial standpoint isn't the only standpoint that matters. There's a whole bunch of other types of investment, and finance is only one small piece of it. And so really you want to also be looking at, is he investing in you from all these other standpoints, from emotional standpoint, from a time standpoint, from an energy standpoint? And if he's not, then financial standpoint may or may not matter that much. Also, it depends on how much money he has. Because if it's not a big deal for him to spend money on you, then from an investment standpoint, it's not much to him. He doesn't feel overly invested. Investment is a very subjective subject, and so he has to feel invested for it to really matter. So how important is it to him that you chip in money, that you pay money? So it can be very costly if he's dating multiple people to pay for every date, right? Which is why a lot of guys just take women out on coffee dates at this point, or do even less, right? They'll want to go for a walk or something like that. And when I was in my early 20s, I didn't have a lot of money. And I don't think that's usually the demographic that most of the women that are probably watching this video are in. However, when I was in my early 20s, I I didn't really have money to spend on dates at all, even coffee dates. It was just way too expensive for me. And so one of the things that I had during that time, and some men have, we'll talk about statistics here in a little bit. There's actually a percentage of men who expect that they're going to pay on the date no matter what. And there's a percentage of men that expect you to split the bill. And there's a percentage of men that expect you to pay on the first date. And we'll talk about what all those numbers are. I'm curious what you think those numbers are, but we'll talk about them here in just a second. But from that standpoint, when I was younger, when I was in my mid-20s, I was like, well, I expected that a woman would at least offer. If I took her out on some kind of date, like we went for drinks or we went for coffee, I'd expect that she'd at least offer. And if she didn't offer, there wouldn't be a second date for us. And I've actually had my car sabotaged because I didn't go on second dates with some women who expected me to go on second dates with them before, but that's another story altogether. And so spending a bunch of money on somebody, like think about it from a guy's perspective. He's taking these women out on dates and he's dating a bunch of women. And sometimes it takes time to find a woman that really fits with you. And so you might go on a whole bunch of dates and you're spending a whole bunch of money on all these different dates and you're not even going to see this woman again. It can be a big financial investment, especially if you don't have any money. And so from a guy's perspective, he needs to be smart, right? He needs to know how much he can spend and take women out on dates accordingly. Some women won't go out on like a coffee date. There are women that I know that absolutely refuse to be taken out on coffee dates. They want to be taken out to dinner. They refuse to be taken out for a walk or something like that. But for some guys, at certain ages and certain financial standpoints, that's all they can do, or that's the only thing that really makes sense to them. So that's what they do. So, men tend to be scared of being used by women for financial resources because a lot of times women use men for their resources. That's a very common thing. There's a lot of women that literally just go on dates to get meals, to get free meals. And I know that there's some women that get offended when I say that, but it's the truth. It's the absolute truth. And if you're a guy and you've been dating for a while, then you know that's the truth. And you've experienced that before. And if you're a woman that gets offended by that, maybe you should get offended by women who are doing that instead of being offended by me calling out that behavior. Because men use women too, and they tend to use women for sex. Women tend to use men for resources. Men tend to, when men or women are using somebody, that's what they tend to use them for. And so men a lot of times are scared that they're going to be used by women for their financial resources, and that's the only reason the woman is there. And so a lot of guys are hesitant about those things, or they have tests, or they want to see that you are actually, showing that he doesn't have to pay for you all the time. So let's talk about some studies here around this. I just want to talk about they've done some studies. There's a Sage Journal study where almost 2/3 of men that were surveyed in this study felt that women should contribute to covering dating expenses, right? So I think it was like a study of about 3,000 men, and they found that 2/3 of them were like, hey, I think that women should cover some of the dating expenses. Maybe not the first date, but some of them, some of the time. And around 44% of men said that they would stop dating a woman who never pays for a date. So 44% of men, if a woman never paid for a date, he'd stop dating her at some point. And like I said, this kind of goes back to the whole idea of men being afraid of women using them for their resources, because it's a very common thing that's out there right now, and it's always been out there. Let's talk about another percentage here. 76% of men also said that they'd feel guilty accepting money from a woman. And so it's one of those things, Here, I'll tell you about another study that kind of explains that 76% of men thing, feeling guilty about accepting money from a woman. They did another survey where they found that 90% of men expect 90% of men expect that they will probably be the one who pays for the first date. So 90% of men. 7% of that 100% of men thought that they should split the bill. So 7% out of all the men out there, 7% think that women, that if they go on a date, the woman should split the bill with the guy. And only 3% of men thought that women should actually pay. I mean, it's like a non-existent number, basically. I mean, I don't know who those 3% of guys are that are out there that expect women to pay for everything. But they're there, right? And so if you're dating one of those guys, you might want to rethink which guys you're dating. And then they did another study. This is a different study, but it got some similar results to it. And they found that 64% of men expect their partner to chip in at some point in terms of dating. So this isn't like a first date kind of thing, but over time in dating, 64% of men expected that women would, their woman partner would chip in at some point to the expenses that he's paying. And then they did another study where they found around 44% of women are bothered, they're bothered if a man expects them to pay for their share of whatever they're doing. So around 44% of women, many of whom get offended if they're expected to pay at all. So just think about those numbers a little bit. You know, if you do go on a first date, most guys, even when I was younger and I didn't have money to do anything, I knew that I was expected every time I go on a date that I'm going to have to pay for the date, you know, and if I didn't have the money, then I wouldn't go on the date because, you know, they were going to expect me to pay for it. So, all right, so let's talk about another consideration here. So that consideration was in the realm of how important is it to him that you chip in? And the first one was investment standpoint. So here's another question that you should ask yourself. Do you want the man that you're dating to be your provider? Do you want him to be your provider? If you do, then it's something that's important to look at. Is he paying? Is he willing to pay? Is he in alignment with this idea of being the provider in the relationship? And if not, you might want to, if you don't really care about that, if you're not worried about a guy being a provider, which I know there's a lot of women that don't, they just absolutely don't care. And if you don't care, then what you should do is stop focusing on the financial investment, and you should start focusing on the energy, the time, the emotion. You know, does he go out of his way to come and see you? What is he doing? Is he showing up on dates? Is he, you know, contacting you? Does he have movement forward towards you? Because that's far more important than just the financial investment. Any guy with money can put in the financial investment, but is he putting in the energy investment? Is he making you a priority in his life? That's far more important if him being a provider isn't important to you. So the next aspect we're going to talk about is cultural aspect. And this is a big one because it changes everywhere. It's different everywhere you go. In the West, generally speaking, we have a little bit more of a liberal environment. In Europe, it's pretty liberal. In the West, it's in America, it's liberal depending on where you are. So some cities are different, some states are different, some subcultures or communities are much different. And so you have to consider what kind of an area you're in and what's going on in that area. So for instance, if you're in more liberal type of cultures, it's generally expected that you're going to pay your way for things. Generally speaking, a lot of times, even in liberal environments, a lot of guys still, they want to be the provider because it's like a biological instinct that a lot of guys have where they want to take care of things. They want to protect you. They want to make sure that you are okay. However, generally speaking, in a lot of liberal cultures, it's many times expected, not even from the men, but from your peers, from your friends, a lot of women in liberal cultures refuse to let men pay for them. And a lot of men and women in these cultures look down on women who try to get the man to pay. And they'll say crazy things to them. Like you'll usually hear things like, what are we in, like the 1950s or something? This is, 2000, whatever, you should pay your way, right? Like a lot of women will get shamed for doing that. And I don't think that that's something to shame somebody for. In fact, I'm not a big fan of shaming people for anything. But in a lot of liberal cultures, they do that. They'll shame women for that. And I've heard a lot of complaints from women who live in liberal cultures where they have experienced getting shamed by other women for wanting more traditional types of relationships. And that is what it is. If you're in more conservative cultures, there's more of an expectation by everybody that the man will pay for you. By the men, by the women, by everyone. If you're in more of a conservative culture, it's expected. If you go into more Eastern type of cultures, it's expected that the man is going to step up and be the provider for you. So there's also, like I said, there's country cultures, there's religious cultures, there's social cultures. All of this determines what's normal, what the norms are for men and women to do. And so the question is, what culture are you in, or what are the norms in your culture? And, maybe you want to change your culture to a different one where you have different expectations on you. And so, or maybe dating different kinds of men from different cultures where he has different expectations of what he wants to do and who he's supposed to be in the relationship. So that's the cultural aspect. So number 5 is one of these things that I hear a lot from women, and it's this. They say he should pay because he asked you out. And if you asked him out, you'd pay, right? Well, on first dates, this doesn't make any sense. And let me tell you why it doesn't make any sense. Around 95% of men out there almost never ever get asked out on a first date by a woman. I like to think that I'm at least a decent looking guy. And the number of times that I've been asked out by women on a date, I can count on one hand. And the number of times where I didn't pay on those dates is not, I paid for every single one of them, right? And I was expected to pay for every single one of them. The only time I've ever not been expected to pay for a date is when it's been over multiple dates and I was actually in some kind of either casual-ish type of dating experience with a woman where we'd been dating for a while, or I was in a relationship and the woman that I was dating wanted to treat me. That was the only time that that's ever occurred for me in dating. I have been in scenarios where women wanted to split the bill before, especially in, it wasn't ever from when women have asked me out though. It was in other scenarios where, I went on a date with a liberal woman or something, and she was like super, very, very determined that I was not going to pay for the date. And, I was just like, whatever, cool. And so that is what it is, right? The likelihood that a guy is going to get asked out on a date, especially a first date, is pretty much non-existent. So basically what you're saying when you say he should pay because he asked you out is that you're saying that men should pay, because the likelihood that men are going to get asked out is almost non-existent. Maybe you ask guy friends out, or maybe you ask guys out on dates, but I guarantee whatever guy you're asking out on dates is the kind of guy that probably gets asked out on dates fairly often, right? Because those are really the only guys that get asked out on dates, is guys that get asked out on dates fairly often. So yeah, so the amount of times, yeah. Okay, so so there's another thing that if you really want to do that, you can do like a friendship frame on a guy where you're like, you pay this time, I'll pay next time. If that's a precedent that you want to set, just realize that you're setting a precedent for that, and that will potentially continue on if he doesn't end up saying, no, you know what, I don't care, I'll pay for it each time. So number 6 is something that we talked a little bit about earlier, which is some women use men for material possessions. And so just like, some women, if she has to split the bill, she won't ever see him again. And other women refuse to let the man pay for them. Some men, if he has to pay, he won't ever see you again. And that's a normal thing that happens with some guys out there, right? Some guys, especially in our culture right now, because there's a lot of anger and frustration and resentment between men and women right now in our culture, at least in the West, in American culture. And so some guys feel like they're being taken advantage of and they don't want to be taken advantage of. And so if he feels like he has to pay for you every single time, he won't ever want to see you again. And so those are the different considerations that you have there. So let's go over them again. Number 1 is investment is incredibly important, and you should want him to invest in you. And financial investment does matter. It absolutely does matter. And it matters to the extent that it matters to him, right? That it's an actual investment to him. How important is it to him that you chip in? So different guys have different ideas about how important it is for you to chip in, whether you want him to be a provider for you or not. So do you want to have him as a provider in your relationship? That's a question you should ask yourself. Next one is culture. What culture are you in this scenario? It depends a lot on whether you're expected to do that or not. He should pay because he asked you out is kind of a silly friendship thing that basically means that he has to pay because he's probably never going to get asked out in his life. I think the last time I got asked out on a first date from a woman was like 15 years ago. Some women use men for material possessions, and men, are afraid to be used by women. So here's what I suggest that you do. Number 1, decide what kind of a relationship that you want and whether you want a man to be a provider for you or not. Number 2, get rid of any expectations that you have around this. So if he doesn't want to pay, or he expects you to pay, or he expects you to split the bill, my suggestion is that you don't take it personally because it has nothing to do with you. Try to come from a space of compassion for a man instead of being like, oh, he's a scumbag and a coward and a narcissist, right? And all those things that women a lot of times say, which are actually toxic ways of talking about men, right? Like if you're saying those things about men, that's actually coming from a toxic space, right? Because you're objectifying them and you're throwing these labels on top of them. And, a much healthier space to come from is a space of compassion. Like, why would he feel like he wants to split the bill, right? Because he doesn't want to be taken advantage of. He doesn't want to be used for his financial resources, blah, 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 blah. And like I said, 90% of men expect that they're going to pay anyway. And then trade your expectations for appreciation. So instead of getting all upset and butthurt with him because of whatever happens in the scenario, no matter what side of the fence you're on, just appreciate the situation, appreciate what you have, appreciate that you get to go on these dates, appreciate, that you've spent some time hanging out with this interesting person. And maybe you'll never want to see him again based on that interaction, but, still come from a place of appreciation instead of expectation, because expectation is what creates pain and anger and frustration. So my suggestion is you stop coming from that space where you're going to be upset by it, where you're taking it personally, all that kind of stuff. If you're in the West, you should plan on paying your side of the bill on the date. You probably won't have to because most men won't make you. However, you should just plan on it. If you're in the West, especially if you're in a liberal culture, you should plan on paying for your side of the date. And so if a guy wants to take you to some really expensive place, you should probably let him know before you go on the date that you don't really have the money or the interest in going to a really expensive place, because one, it creates all kinds of weird expectations around you and the situation and what's going on between the two of you, but also because it's like, you know, it's you know, you don't want to be in a weird situation where you have to pay half of a really expensive dinner date that you didn't even want to go on in the first place. And also, you know, it's one of those things where, you know, if I were you, I wouldn't be going on dinner dates. That's my suggestion. I wouldn't be going on long dates for first dates anyway, especially if you're doing it online. We're coming out with an online, a lot of women have been asking me to come out with some materials on online dating and how to weed out guys and how to get guys that they want on first dates and how to be as attractive as they can be. And so I'm going to be coming out with a program here pretty soon and some videos and stuff around that pretty soon. But one of my suggestions is that you only go, if you're going on a first date with a guy, only do something like 30 minutes long. Don't do these 2-hour long dates and stuff. You end up getting stuck at a date and you're in dinner and you're like, you know, you don't really like the guy, but you're stuck there and you can't leave. You know, it's just a bad situation in general. If he offers to pay, always let the man pay. If he offers to pay, always let him pay. It's very, very important. And one of the things I didn't talk about is feminine, masculine polarities. And one of my suggestions is that you always push men into the masculine male role that we used to have. And it's not because I think we should all go back to the 1950s and all that kind of nonsense. But most of those roles that we had, most of them benefited women. And anybody that says anything else to you is trying to sell you something that's probably not what you actually want. Most of those roles were beneficial to you. Men showing up, picking you up, paying for things, you know, leading the way, all that stuff is far more beneficial to you than doing all this thing where women are taking the lead and, you know, taking men out on dates and paying for things and all that kind of stuff. It's far more beneficial that you guys are in those traditional roles. And anytime that he wants to go into one of those roles, let him. And anytime you can push him into one of those roles, and I suggest you don't do it around finances because it's kind of a touchy subject for a lot of men these days. But anytime you can push them into one of those roles for other things, for being masculine and manly, you should push them into those roles and push yourself into the feminine role, because it creates polarity and passion in the relationship. And if you're overly worried about this, like I said before, refuse to go on dates where there's a lot of money being spent. Just go on walking dates, grab a beer, get coffee or tea, go hike up a mountain, or do something where you can talk and get to know each other and money isn't a huge issue.